In the main hall of what had been my home for 37 years, my stepson Marcus raised his champagne glass with that arrogant smile I had learned to fear. The crystal chandelier I had chosen, piece by piece, reflected the golden liquid as he proclaimed to the 50 guests, "Finally, this house belongs to someone who deserves it." His eyes met mine across the room, cold as winter steel. "Margaret, you have 24 hours to pack your things and get out of my house." The laughter that followed felt like knives cutting through my chest. Each guest's chuckle, another confirmation that I had become invisible in my own home. Can you imagine being discarded like garbage after dedicating 4 decades of your life to building a family that wasn't yours by blood, but was yours by love? What would you do if the man you helped raise looked at you with such contempt that you questioned every sacrifice you had ever made? I remained silent in that corner, watching Marcus and his wife Victoria toast their fortune with the expensive wine I had chosen for special occasions. But what none of them knew was that the next morning, when Lawyer Harrison would read the complete will, my late husband's final words would transform that celebration into the beginning of their worst nightmare. My name is Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield. I am 62 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was the wife of Richard Thornfield, one of the most successful real estate developers on the East Coast. When Richard died of a sudden heart attack, I thought I had lost everything that mattered. I was wrong. I had only lost the illusion that family meant unconditional love. For 37 years, I dedicated my life to being the perfect stepmother to Marcus, who was 8 when I married his father. I gave up my career as a corporate attorney to focus on his education, his emotional needs, his dreams. I was present at every soccer game, every graduation, every moment when he needed maternal support that his biological mother, who had died in an accident, could no longer provide. I loved him as if he had been born from my own body. Richard and I never had children together, not by choice but by one of life's cruel twists. After 3 miscarriages, the doctors told us it would be impossible. So I poured all my maternal love into Marcus, believing that love was stronger than blood, that dedication was more important than genetics. How naive I was. The first signs that something was wrong appeared right after the funeral. Marcus, who had always called me Mom since he was 12, suddenly started referring to me as Margaret in front of others. Small comments began to surface. "Well, technically she's not really family," or "It's complicated, she's just my father's widow." Each word was a small death, a gradual erasure of the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to build his. Victoria, his wife of 5 years, was the poison that accelerated everything. A woman of 28 with the ambition of a shark and the coldness of a snake. From the day she entered our family, she began planting seeds of doubt. "Don't you think it's strange that Margaret has so much influence over your father's decisions?" Or, "She's not getting any younger, Marcus. You need to think about your future." But the real blow came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Marcus announced he was moving into the main house with Victoria to take care of things. The house that Richard and I had designed together, where every corner held memories of our marriage, where I had created a home with love and dedication. "It makes sense," he said, without looking me in the eyes. "This house is too big for just you, and Victoria and I need space to start our family." I accepted it, like I had accepted so many other humiliations, believing that keeping the peace was more important than defending my dignity. I moved to the guest wing, becoming a stranger in my own home, watching how Victoria redecorated our rooms, how she threw away photos of Richard and me, how she slowly erased any trace that I had ever been the lady of that house. The reading of the will was scheduled for today, exactly 6 months after Richard's death. Marcus was convinced everything would go to him. After all, he was the biological son, the heir, the one who carried the Thornfield name. What he didn't know was that Richard had been much more observant than anyone imagined. 3 months before his death, my husband had called me to his office for a private conversation. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use, "I've been watching things, and I'm worried about what might happen to you after I'm gone." At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic. Richard had always been protective, sometimes excessively so. But now I understand he saw what I refused to see. The lawyer, Harrison Mackenzie, had been Richard's friend for over 20 years and his legal advisor for all major business decisions. a man in his 70s with the precision of a Swiss watch and the discretion of a priest. When he called to confirm today's meeting, his tone was unusually serious. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want you to know that your husband left very specific instructions about how this reading should be conducted. Trust the process, no matter what happens." Now, as I write these words 12 hours after that humiliating celebration, I can still feel the echo of their laughter, the weight of their contempt, the pain of being treated like an intruder in the life I had helped build. But I also feel something else growing inside me, a cold, calculated fury that I had forgotten I was capable of feeling. Marcus thinks he has won. Victoria is already planning renovations and talking about selling some of Richard's most precious possessions to modernize the house. They have no idea that my late husband, the man who built an empire with cunning and strategy, would never leave the woman he loved for 4 decades at the mercy of people who saw her only as an obstacle. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp, Lawyer Harrison will open that sealed envelope and read Richard's final will. And when he reaches the last page, when he reads the final clause that my husband wrote in his own handwriting just 1 week before his death, Marcus's arrogant smile will disappear forever. Because Richard Thornfield didn't just leave me money or properties. He left me something much more powerful, the truth, documented and legally unbreakable, about who really deserves to inherit the empire we built together. The celebration is over. Now begins the reckoning. The morning after the celebration, I woke up at 5:30, as I had done every day for the past 37 years. But this time, instead of preparing breakfast for a family that appreciated me, I sat in the small kitchen of the guest wing, drinking coffee from a chipped mug that Victoria had relegated to the helps dishes. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had designed every detail of that house was now living like a guest in her own home. Through the window, I could see Marcus and Victoria's bedroom. The curtains were still drawn, probably sleeping off their champagne hangover. They had no idea that in 4 hours their world would crumble. But I knew, and that knowledge was the only thing keeping me sane. At 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Harrison Mackenzie. "Margaret, I hope you slept well. Are you ready for what's coming?" His voice carried a weight I had never heard before, a mixture of anticipation and concern that made my stomach tighten. "Harrison, Richard told me there were surprises in the will, but he never gave me details." "What exactly am I walking into today?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "Let's just say your husband was a man who planned for every contingency. He knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with, and he acted accordingly. Trust me, Margaret. Trust Richard. And most importantly, trust yourself." The line went silent for a moment. "One more thing. Don't let them see you sweat. Today, you need to be the corporate attorney you were before you became a wife and mother. Can you do that?" The question hit me like lightning. For 37 years, I had buried Margaret the lawyer, the woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, who had never lost a corporate litigation case, who had been offered partnerships at 3 of the most prestigious firms in the country before choosing love over career. Could I resurrect that woman? "Yes," I replied with a firmness that surprised even me. "I think it's time she made a comeback." At 9 o'clock, I heard voices in the main hallway. Marcus and Victoria were arguing about something, but their tone was celebratory, excited. They were probably discussing how to spend their inheritance. Victoria's sharp voice cut through the air. "The first thing we need to do is get rid of all that old furniture. And those hideous paintings Margaret chose. This house needs a complete renovation to reflect our style. And Margaret needs to be out by tomorrow," Marcus added with that casual cruelty that had become his trademark. "I don't want her depressing energy affecting our new beginning. This is our time, Vic. Our house, our money, our future." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. In 1 hour, they would discover just how wrong they were. The lawyer's office was located in the historic district, in a building that exuded old money and established power. When I arrived, Marcus and Victoria were already there, sitting in the leather chairs facing Harrison's massive mahogany desk. They looked like children on Christmas morning, barely containing their excitement. "Margaret," Marcus said without standing up, "I hope you understand that, after today, things will be different. But don't worry, I'm not heartless. I'm prepared to offer you a small monthly allowance so you can rent an apartment. Something modest, appropriate for your new situation. Victoria nodded with fake sympathy. We just think it's time for everyone to move on with their lives. You're still young enough to start over, Margaret. Maybe even find someone new. The condescension in her voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But instead of feeling hurt, I felt something else. A cold clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The lawyer in me was waking up, and she was hungry. Harrison entered the office carrying a sealed envelope and several documents. His expression was serious, almost solemn. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this will was written entirely by Richard Thornfield, with minimal legal assistance from me. Every word, every decision, every clause reflects his wishes and his alone. He sat down and opened the envelope with ceremonial precision. The last will and testament of Richard James Thornfield, written on March 15th, 2024, exactly 1 week before his death. Marcus straightened in his chair, his eyes shining with greed. Victoria grabbed his hand, both of them practically vibrating with anticipation. I, Richard James Thornfield, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. Harrison's voice was steady, professional. First, I want to state that this document supersedes all previous wills and represents my final wishes regarding the distribution of my assets. The reading continued with the standard legal formalities, but I could see Marcus growing impatient. He wanted to get to the good part, to the numbers, to the confirmation of his inheritance. To my stepson Marcus Thornfield, who has lived in my house and benefited from my resources for over 30 years, I leave the following: my collection of vintage cars, valued at approximately $500,000, and my membership in the country club, paid for the next 5 years. Marcus's face went white. Wait, what? That's it? What about the house? What about the real estate empire? What about the $32 million? Harrison raised his hand, asking for silence. To my stepson's wife, Victoria Thornfield, I leave my collection of first edition books, valued at approximately $50,000, with the hope that she will finally learn to read something of substance. I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Even in death, Richard couldn't resist a jab at Victoria's intellectual limitations. The remainder of my estate, including all real estate properties, business investments, bank accounts, and assets totaling approximately $32 million, I leave entirely to my beloved wife, Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked like he had been struck by lightning. Victoria started hyperventilating, but Harrison wasn't finished. However, he continued, there is one final clause, written in my own handwriting, that I want to be read verbatim. He pulled out a separate sheet of paper, clearly written in Richard's unmistakable penmanship. Margaret, my love, if you are hearing this, it means I am no longer there to protect you from the people who never deserved your devotion. The house you are sitting in, the business I built, the money in our accounts, none of it would exist without your support, your sacrifice, your love. You gave up your career as one of the most promising attorneys in the country to help me raise a son who was never yours by blood, but was always yours by choice. For 37 years, you were the foundation upon which everything was built. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I didn't care. Richard's words were reaching me from beyond the grave, validating every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, every tear I had cried in silence. Marcus, if you are listening to this with surprise or indignation, then you have learned nothing from the man I tried to raise you to be. The woman sitting next to you in that office loved you when your own mother could no longer do so. She attended every game, every recital, every graduation. She celebrated your victories and comforted your defeats. And how did you repay her? With contempt, with ingratitude, with cruelty that breaks my heart, even as I write these words. Marcus tried to speak, but Harrison continued relentlessly. The cars I'm leaving you are worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Use them wisely, because it's the last money you'll see from me. And Victoria, those books are worth more than your entire contribution to this family. Maybe it's time you learned something about respect and gratitude. The final blow was coming, and I could feel it in the air like electricity before a storm. Margaret, you are now the sole owner of everything I have built. But more than that, you are free. free from the obligation to love people who don't deserve it, free from the need to justify your place in a family you helped create, free to be the formidable woman I fell in love with 40 years ago. Use that freedom wisely, my love. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. The office fell into absolute silence. Marcus was staring at the floor, his entire world collapsing around him. Victoria was crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure rage. And me? For the first time in 6 months, I felt like I could breathe again. 24 hours after the will reading, I sat in what was now unequivocally my house, watching through the window as Marcus and Victoria loaded their belongings into a rented truck. The irony was delicious. They had exactly the same 24 hours they had given me to pack their lives and leave what they had considered their guaranteed inheritance. But something bothered me. During those final months of Richard's life, I had noticed changes in his behavior that I had attributed to stress from work and his deteriorating health. Now, with the clarity that comes from distance and revelation, I began to connect dots that painted a much darker picture. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 15 years. "Patricia, it's Margaret Thornfield. Yes, I know it's been too long. Listen, I need to ask you something important. Do you still have contacts at the district attorney's office?" Patricia Wells had been my study partner at Harvard Law and later my colleague at Morrison & Associates before I left to marry Richard. She was now a criminal defense attorney with an impressive reputation and, more importantly, discretion that could be trusted. "Margaret, I heard about Richard. I'm so sorry for your loss. And yes, I still have contacts everywhere that matters. What's going on?" Her voice carried the same sharp intelligence I remembered from our law school days. "I need to understand some things about Richard's final months, things that didn't make sense then but are starting to form a pattern now. Can we meet? Somewhere private?" 2 hours later, I was sitting in Patricia's downtown office, a space that exuded the same understated power I had once commanded in corporate boardrooms. The woman across from me had aged gracefully, her gray hair cut in a sharp bob that framed intelligent brown eyes behind designer glasses. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a legal pad. "And I mean everything, even details that seem irrelevant." I began with the changes I had observed in Richard during his final 6 months. He started working late more frequently, but not at the office. He would lock himself in his home study for hours, making phone calls in whispers. When I asked about it, he would say it was boring business stuff and change the subject. Patricia took notes with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that details could mean the difference between freedom and prison. What about his relationship with Marcus during this period? That's the strange part. Richard became increasingly distant from Marcus, but I thought it was just the natural tension between a father who was aging and a son who was impatient to take control of the business. Now I'm wondering if there was something more specific. I pulled out a folder I had prepared. 3 weeks before Richard died, I found this in his jacket pocket when I was taking his clothes to the dry cleaner. It was a business card for a private investigator named David Chen with handwritten notes on the back. Financial records, March 2024, and verify suspicions. Patricia studied the card with professional interest. "Did you ever ask Richard about this?" I tried, but he dismissed it as research for a potential business acquisition. Richard was always investigating competitors or potential investments, so it didn't seem unusual at the time. But now you're wondering if he was investigating something closer to home. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression growing serious. "Margaret, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Do you think Marcus was stealing from Richard?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. I had been dancing around this suspicion for months, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real, terrifying, and surprisingly liberating. I think Marcus was doing more than stealing money. I think he was systematically planning to take control of everything, possibly with the help of someone with legal knowledge. I paused, feeling the weight of my next words. I think he was planning to have Richard declared mentally incompetent. Patricia's pen stopped moving. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence?" "Not yet, but I have something better. I have resources now, and I have the determination to find the truth." I reached into my purse and pulled out another document. "Richard left me a safety deposit box I didn't know existed. This is the key. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to discover what my husband was hiding. That evening, I had dinner alone in the main dining room for the first time in years. The silence was profound, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of exclusion I had grown accustomed to. It was the silence of possibility, of a clean slate, of a woman who was finally free to be herself. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something told me to answer. "Mrs. Thornfield, this is David Chen from Chen Investigations. I believe you found my business card among your late husband's belongings." My heart started racing. "Mr. Chen, yes. I was planning to contact you. Ma'am, with all due respect, I think we need to meet as soon as possible. What your husband discovered in the months before his death. Let's just say it's more serious than simple financial irregularities. Are you somewhere safe right now?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "Safe? What do you mean?" "Mrs. Thornfield, your husband hired me to investigate suspicious financial movements in his company accounts. What we found suggests that someone very close to him was not only stealing money, but also planning something much more dangerous. Your husband died before we could complete the investigation, but the evidence we gathered, it changes everything." I gripped the phone tighter. "Mr. Chen, can you meet me tomorrow morning? I have something to show you too, and I think it's time we put all the pieces together." "Absolutely, but Mrs. Thornfield, don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not anyone. Your husband made me promise that if something happened to him, I would make sure you got the truth, but only when it was safe to do so. I think that time has come." After hanging up, I walked through the house that was now entirely mine, but I no longer felt the comfort I had once found in these rooms. Every shadow seemed to hide secrets. Every corner seemed to whisper warnings about dangers I was only beginning to understand. I went to Richard's study and sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the books and documents of a man who had built an empire with intelligence and determination. On his desk, there was a framed photo of our wedding day, both of us young and full of dreams we thought would last forever. "What did you discover, my love?" I whispered to the photo. "And how dangerous are the people who killed those dreams?" Because now I was certain of something that chilled me to the bone. Richard's heart attack might not have been as natural as everyone believed, and if I was right, if my suspicions had any foundation in reality, then I wasn't just fighting for money or justice, I was fighting for my life. I opened Richard's desk drawer and found his personal agenda. Flipping through the pages of his final weeks, I found entries that now seemed ominous. Meeting with Chen, 2 p.m. Review security footage. Talk to Harrison about protection protocols. Protection protocols? Richard had been preparing for something, and that something had cost him his life. I closed the agenda and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, I would not just be the grieving widow seeking answers. Tomorrow, I would be Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, corporate attorney, investigator, and if necessary, a woman capable of fighting for the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. The game was about to begin, and this time, I would be playing by my own rules. The First National Bank building stood like a fortress in the financial district, its marble columns and brass fixtures speaking of old money and older secrets. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked through its heavy doors, carrying the key that would unlock the mystery of my husband's final months. The safety deposit box was located in the basement vault, a room that felt like a temple to financial discretion. Box number 417 was larger than I had expected, and when the bank employee left me alone with it, my hands trembled as I inserted the key. Inside, I found a world of evidence that painted a picture so shocking it took my breath away. The first document was a detailed financial analysis in Richard's handwriting spanning 6 months of investigation. At the top, in his careful script, were the words, "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means they succeeded. Don't let them get away with it. The truth is all here. Fight back, my love. You have everything you need." My husband had documented a systematic theft that went far beyond what I had imagined. Marcus hadn't just been skimming money from the company accounts. He had been siphoning funds through a network of shell companies, falsifying invoices, and redirecting client payments to accounts only he controlled. The total amount stolen over 3 years exceeded $4 million. But the financial theft was just the beginning. I found a folder marked medical evidence that made my blood run cold. Inside were photocopies of medical records, prescription bottles, and a handwritten note from Richard that read, "They've been putting something in my food. Dr. Morrison confirmed the blood tests show traces of digoxin, not prescribed by any doctor. Symptoms match those of gradual poisoning." My hands started shaking uncontrollably. They had been poisoning him. Marcus and Victoria had been slowly killing my husband while stealing his money and planning to inherit everything. The next document was even more devastating. A recording device with a note attached. "Margaret, this contains a conversation between Marcus and Victoria from February 28th. Listen to it when you're ready to hear the truth about who you've been living with." I couldn't listen to it there, not in that sterile bank vault. But there was more. At the bottom of the box was a thick envelope marked "Insurance Policy for Margaret Only." Inside, I found something that changed everything. A detailed plan that Richard had developed with David Chen and lawyer Harrison Mackenzie. If anything happened to him, I would have all the tools necessary not just to expose the truth, but to ensure that justice was served. My phone buzzed. A text from David Chen. "Coffee shop on 5th Street, corner table. I'm the Asian man in the gray suit reading the Wall Street Journal. Come alone." 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and the quiet confidence of someone who specialized in uncovering other people's secrets. David Chen looked exactly like what he was, a former FBI agent who now used his skills to help people like Richard discover uncomfortable truths. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but I'm glad you found the safety deposit box. Did you listen to the recording?" "Not yet. I needed to process everything else first. David, my husband was being poisoned, wasn't he?" His expression grew grave. "Your husband hired me initially to investigate financial irregularities he had noticed, but as we dug deeper, we discovered something much more sinister. Yes, the blood tests we conducted privately showed consistent traces of digoxin in his system. It's a heart medication that, in small doses over time, can cause the exact symptoms your husband was experiencing." I felt the world spinning around me. How long had they been doing this? Based on the medical evidence we gathered, approximately 8 months. The beauty of digoxin poisoning is that it mimics natural heart problems, especially in a man of your husband's age who already had some cardiac issues. If he hadn't been suspicious and asked for specific tests, it would have looked like a completely natural death. But it wasn't natural. No, ma'am, it wasn't. Your husband was murdered slowly and methodically by people who had access to his food and medication. The words hit me like physical blows. For months, I had shared meals with Richard's killers. I had watched Victoria prepare his favorite dishes with what I thought was genuine care. I had seen Marcus bring his father his evening medication with what appeared to be filial devotion. What about the financial evidence? How much did they steal? David pulled out a tablet and showed me a comprehensive analysis. Over 3 years, they diverted approximately $4.2 million from various company accounts. But here's what made your husband really suspicious. They were also liquidating assets and moving money to offshore accounts. They weren't just stealing. They were preparing to disappear. Disappear? Mrs. Thornfield, we found evidence that Marcus and Victoria had already purchased property in the Cayman Islands under false names. They had passports prepared with different identities. This wasn't just theft. It was a complete escape plan. I stared at the numbers on the screen, each figure representing a level of betrayal I couldn't have imagined. They were going to kill Richard, inherit everything, and then disappear with the money. That's exactly what they were planning. But your husband was smarter than they gave him credit for. Everything they thought they would inherit was already being transferred to legal structures that would protect you and ensure they got nothing. Is that why the will was so specific? The will was just the final piece of a much larger strategy. Your husband spent his last months not just gathering evidence of their crimes, but building a legal fortress around you. The $32 million they thought they would inherit? It was never really available to them. Your husband had been systematically moving assets into trusts and legal structures that only you could access. I felt a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Even while being slowly murdered, Richard had been protecting me, building a case, preparing for a war he knew he might not survive. David, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Am I in danger? His pause was answer enough. Mrs. Thornfield, Marcus and Victoria invested 3 years of their lives in this plan. They committed murder to execute it. And now they've discovered that not only did they get almost nothing, but all the evidence of their crimes still exists. Yes, I believe you could be in danger. What do you recommend? First, we need to listen to that recording together. You need to understand exactly who you're dealing with. Then, we need to decide how to proceed. Your husband left you with enough evidence to put them in prison for life, but we need to be strategic about how we use it. I thought about the house where I had been living alone since the will reading, about Marcus's final words as he left. This isn't over, Margaret. This is far from over. There's something else, David continued. Your husband suspected they might try to have you declared mentally incompetent if the inheritance plan failed. We found evidence that they had already consulted with a lawyer about guardianship procedures. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. They were going to have me committed. It's a common strategy when large inheritances are involved. Have the heir declared mentally unfit, assume legal guardianship, and control all the assets. Your husband was preparing defenses against that possibility too. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I had discovered. David, I want to hear that recording now. I want to know exactly what kind of monsters I've been living with. He handed me a pair of earphones. Mrs. Thornfield, what you're about to hear will change how you see the last 3 years of your life. Are you ready for that? I put on the earphones and pressed play. And for the next 20 minutes, I listened to the 2 people I had loved and trusted planning my husband's murder with the casual efficiency of ordering groceries. When it ended, I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that coffee shop an hour earlier. I was someone harder, colder, and absolutely determined to make sure that Richard's killers paid for every drop of poison they had put in his food. The war was about to begin. If you're watching me now, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt completely betrayed by people you trusted with your life? Because what I was about to discover would make everything I'd learned so far seem like child's play. The voices coming through the earphones were crystal clear, recorded by the device Richard had hidden in the main living room 3 weeks before his death. What I heard in those 20 minutes destroyed any remaining illusion I had about the people I had called family. Victoria's voice, sharp and impatient. Marcus, your father is taking too long to die. We've been giving him the digoxin for 8 months, and he's still fighting it. Maybe we need to increase the dose. Marcus, cold as winter. No, we can't risk it. If the dose is too high, it will show up in an autopsy. We need this to look natural. Besides, Doctor, Morrison already said his heart is weakening. It's just a matter of time. Time we don't have. Victoria's frustration was palpable. What if he changes the will again? What if he decides to leave everything to some charity? What if he gets suspicious about the missing money? He won't. The old man trusts me completely. And even if he suspected something, what could he do? All the transfers have been made through legitimate business transactions. The shell companies look completely legal. What about Margaret? She's been asking questions about why you're working so late, why you're always on the phone with business associates. The contempt in Marcus's laugh made my stomach turn. Margaret is too naive to be a threat. She's been playing housewife for so long she's forgotten how to think like a lawyer. Besides, once Dad is gone and I inherit everything, she'll be dependent on whatever allowance I decide to give her. If we give her any allowance at all, Victoria added with malicious satisfaction. I've been researching guardianship laws. If we can prove she's emotionally unstable after Richard's death, we can have her declared mentally incompetent. Then we control everything, and she becomes just another expense we can eliminate. Brilliant. Grief-induced dementia. Very believable for a woman her age who just lost her husband. Doctor, Harrison owes me favors. I'm sure he can provide the necessary medical documentation. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. They had planned everything, not just Richard's murder, but my complete destruction as well. Victoria continued. I found the perfect facility upstate, Brookhaven Manor. It specializes in difficult elderly patients. Once she's there, isolated from any friends or legal contacts, she could live for years without anyone questioning her condition. And if she doesn't live for years? Marcus's question was casual, as if he were asking about the weather. Well, these facilities can be quite stressful for people with fragile mental health. Accidents happen, medications get confused. You know how it is. The recording continued with discussions about specific bank accounts, transfer schedules, and plans for their new life in the Cayman Islands. They had researched everything: new identities, property purchases, even which private schools they would send their future children to, funded by money stolen from the man who had raised Marcus with love and patience. But the worst part came at the end, when Marcus made a comment that revealed the depth of his cruelty. You know what I'll miss most about the old man? The way he trusted me completely, even when I was robbing him blind. There's something almost touching about that level of naivety. And Margaret's eternal gratitude, Victoria added with a laugh. The way she looked at you like you were the son she never had. If only she knew she was raising her own executioner. Their laughter filled my ears like poison, and I had to remove the earphones before I became physically sick. David watched my face as I processed what I had heard. Mrs. Thornfield, I know this is difficult, but there's more you need to know. He pulled out another folder. After your husband's death, we continued monitoring Marcus and Victoria's communications. They haven't given up on their plan. In fact, they've accelerated it. What do you mean? 3 days ago, Marcus made an appointment with Dr. Harrison, the psychiatrist he mentioned in the recording. Tomorrow, he's planning to file a petition with the probate court claiming that you're suffering from severe depression and early dementia symptoms related to your husband's death. I felt the world tilting around me. They're still trying to have me declared incompetent? The will reading complicated their plans, but it didn't stop them. If they can prove you're mentally unfit, they can challenge the will on the grounds that Richard was manipulated by someone who was already showing signs of cognitive decline. David showed me printed emails between Marcus and a lawyer named Robert Sterling. The correspondence was clinical, calculating, and absolutely terrifying. They had documented my erratic behavior since Richard's death, how I had isolated myself in the guest wing, how I had stopped maintaining my appearance, how I had been talking to myself in the garden. Every moment of grief, every tear shed in private, every conversation I had had with Richard's memory had been twisted into evidence of mental instability. But none of this is true, I said, knowing how weak that sounded. Truth is irrelevant in these cases. What matters is documentation and credible witnesses. Marcus has been building a case against you for months, even before Richard's death. He has photos, timestamps, even recordings of conversations he claims show your deteriorating mental state. I thought about all the times Marcus had insisted on walking with me in the garden after Richard's death, how he had encouraged me to talk about my feelings, how he had suggested I shouldn't make any important decisions while grieving. He had been gathering evidence for my own destruction. David, what can we do? We can use their own weapons against them. Your husband anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. Tomorrow morning, before Marcus can file his petition, we're going to file our own legal action. He pulled out a thick legal document. Your husband worked with Harrison Mackenzie to prepare a criminal complaint detailing every aspect of Marcus and Victoria's crimes: financial fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, and actual murder. We have bank records, medical evidence, recordings, and witness testimony from the private investigator your husband hired to monitor them. Witness testimony? Mrs. Thornfield, your husband wasn't the only one they poisoned. We found evidence that they had been practicing their technique on elderly residents of Victoria's previous workplace, a private nursing home in Connecticut. 2 suspicious deaths in 6 months, both involving patients who had changed their wills to benefit Victoria shortly before dying. The scope of their evil was beyond anything I could have imagined. They're serial killers. That's exactly what they are. And tomorrow morning, when Marcus walks into that courthouse thinking he's going to have you declared incompetent, he's going to find FBI agents waiting for him instead. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt something that resembled hope. What do you need me to do? First, we need to get you somewhere safe. Tonight, you're going to stay in a secure location. Tomorrow morning, you're going to walk into that courthouse not as a grieving widow, but as the primary witness in a federal murder investigation. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, David handed me one final document. Your husband wrote this letter for you to read tonight, after you learned the truth. He wanted you to understand that none of this was your fault, and that the love you gave Marcus was real, even if his response to it wasn't. I held the letter like it was made of glass, knowing it would be the last communication I would ever receive from the man who had loved me enough to prepare for his own murder just to protect me. "Mrs. Thornfield," David said as we walked toward his car, "tomorrow we begin the process of making sure your husband gets justice. Are you ready to fight?" I looked at the letter in my hands, thinking about Richard's final months, about the poison in his food, about the laughter of his killers. "David, I've been ready my entire life. I just forgot for a while. The woman who had buried her career to build a family was gone. Tomorrow, Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, attorney and prosecutor, would rise from her ashes to destroy the people who had murdered her husband and tried to steal her life. The reckoning was about to begin. That night, in a secure hotel room downtown, I read Richard's final letter by lamplight. His words reached across the void of death to give me the strength I needed for what was coming. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened, but it also means you now have the power to make it right. I know you blame yourself for not seeing the signs, for trusting people who didn't deserve it, for believing that love could conquer the darkness in human hearts. Don't. The capacity to love unconditionally is not a weakness. It's the greatest strength a person can have. Marcus and Victoria's inability to value that love is their failing, not yours." His words continued. "I've spent the last months of my life building a fortress around you, not just of money and legal protections, but of truth. Use that truth like the weapon it is. Fight not just for justice, but for every other person who might fall victim to predators like them. Be the lawyer you were always meant to be, the woman I fell in love with, the force of nature that can turn tragedy into triumph." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse next to the evidence that would destroy my husband's killers. Then I did something I hadn't done in 37 years. I prepared for legal warfare. David had arranged for Patricia Wells to join our team, along with 2 FBI agents and a prosecutor from the district attorney's office. When we met at 6 a.m. in the hotel conference room, I was no longer the grieving widow who had discovered her inheritance 3 days ago. I was Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, legal strategist, and I was about to remind everyone why I had never lost a case in my previous career. "Agent Rodriguez," I said to the lead FBI investigator, "what's our timeline for the arrests?" "We have warrants ready for Marcus and Victoria Thornfield on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and attempted poisoning. We're coordinating with local police to execute simultaneous arrests at their current residence and Victoria's workplace." Patricia reviewed the evidence files with the methodical precision I remembered from our law school days. "Margaret, the case against them is airtight, but we need to be prepared for their defense strategy. They're going to claim that Richard was paranoid, possibly suffering from dementia himself, and that all of this evidence was fabricated." "Let them try," I replied, feeling the cold certainty of someone who had all the facts on her side. "We have bank records that can't be faked, medical evidence from 3 independent laboratories, and recordings of them planning murder. Most importantly, we have pattern evidence from Victoria's previous workplace." Agent Rodriguez nodded. "The Connecticut deaths are key. We exhumed both bodies last week, and the toxicology reports confirmed digoxin poisoning in both cases. Victoria left a trail of bodies behind her. At 8 o'clock, we received confirmation that the first phase of our operation was complete. Marcus had been arrested at his temporary apartment as he prepared to leave for the courthouse. Victoria had been taken into custody at the marketing firm where she worked, in front of her colleagues and clients. Their plan to have me declared incompetent had been permanently interrupted, but I wasn't satisfied with just their arrests. I wanted them to understand exactly how completely they had been outmaneuvered. "Patricia, I want to be present when they're interrogated. I want them to see my face when they realize that the naive housewife they planned to destroy has become their prosecutor." 2 hours later, I was sitting in an observation room watching Marcus through one-way glass. He was no longer the arrogant man who had humiliated me at the will reading. Handcuffed and dressed in an orange jumpsuit, he looked exactly like what he was, a common criminal who had been caught. Agent Rodriguez entered the interrogation room with a thick file of evidence. "Mr. Thornfield, we're going to give you one opportunity to cooperate. Your stepmother has provided us with extensive documentation of your crimes, and we have enough evidence to ensure you spend the rest of your life in prison." Marcus's reaction was exactly what I had expected. Denial, followed by rage, followed by desperate attempts to shift blame. Margaret is lying. She's been mentally unstable since my father's death. This is all some kind of revenge fantasy because she didn't inherit what she expected. Mr. Thornfield, your stepmother inherited $32 million and complete control of your father's estate. Why would she need revenge? The look of confusion on Marcus's face was almost comical. He hadn't considered the logical flaw in his own defense. Agent Rodriguez placed the first piece of evidence on the table, the recording of Marcus and Victoria planning Richard's murder. Would you like to explain this conversation to us? As Marcus listened to his own voice discussing dosages of digoxin and plans for my institutionalization, I watched 20 years of fake affection drain from his face. For the first time since I had known him, I was seeing the real Marcus, cold, calculating, and absolutely without remorse. That recording is illegal. You can't use surveillance obtained without consent. Actually, we can. Your father installed that recording device in his own home, on his own property, to gather evidence of crimes being committed against him. Perfectly legal. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, with Marcus's story changing every time he was confronted with new evidence. But what struck me most was his complete lack of grief or regret about Richard's death. Even when caught, even facing life in prison, he showed no emotion about murdering the man who had raised him. Victoria's interrogation was even more revealing. Unlike Marcus, who maintained a veneer of indignation, Victoria immediately began negotiating for a plea deal. She was willing to provide details about their entire operation in exchange for a reduced sentence. "I have information about other victims," she told the prosecutor. "Marcus and I weren't the only ones doing this. There's a whole network of people targeting elderly, wealthy individuals. I can give you names, locations, methods." Through the glass, I watched her transform into the predator she had always been underneath the mask of grieving daughter-in-law. She described their crimes with the detachment of someone discussing a business transaction, how they had researched targets, how they had gained access to homes and medications, how they had planned escape routes and new identities. "The elderly are perfect victims," she explained with chilling matter-of-factness. "They're isolated, often estranged from family, and their deaths are rarely questioned if they appear natural. A little digoxin over time, some strategic inheritance planning, and you can walk away with millions." By the end of the day, we had extracted confessions to 17 separate incidents across 5 states. Marcus and Victoria weren't just my husband's killers. They were part of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 5 years. As I drove back to my house that evening, my house, legally and morally mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: absolute peace. Richard's killers were in custody, facing charges that would keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. The fortune they had tried to steal was secure in my hands. The life they had tried to destroy had been transformed into something stronger. But I wasn't finished. That night, I sat in Richard's study and began writing letters to the families of Marcus and Victoria's other victims. Some of those families had never known their loved ones were murdered. Others had suspected but couldn't prove it. All of them deserved to know the truth. I also began organizing the evidence for the civil lawsuits we would file to recover the stolen money and ensure that every penny of their ill-gotten gains was returned to the victims' families. Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, attorney, was officially back in practice, and her first case was going to be the complete destruction of an enterprise built on greed and murder. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of transforming my personal victory into justice for everyone who had been touched by their evil. Because Richard had been right. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. But sometimes, living well means ensuring that predators can never hurt anyone else. The war was won, but the work of justice was just beginning. 3 weeks after the arrests, I transformed Richard's study into a command center for what would become the largest elder abuse prosecution in state history. The mahogany desk that had once held his business plans now supported evidence files, legal briefs, and witness statements that would ensure Marcus and Victoria never saw freedom again. Patricia had moved her practice temporarily into my house, turning the guest dining room into a satellite office. Together, we were building something unprecedented, a comprehensive legal assault that would not only prosecute the criminals, but also create lasting protections for future victims. Margaret, we've identified 23 additional cases across 7 states, Patricia announced, spreading photographs across the conference table we had set up in the main living room. The FBI task force is calling it Operation Silver Snare. Victoria's cooperation has opened floodgates we never knew existed. Each photograph represented a life stolen, a family destroyed, dreams murdered for money. Eleanor Patterson, 84, poisoned over 6 months while her devoted nephew inherited her art collection. William Chen, 79, slowly killed with digitalis while his caring home health aide redirected his pension payments. Thomas and Ruth Mackenzie, married for 56 years, both eliminated when they discovered their financial advisor had been embezzling their retirement savings. How many perpetrators are we looking at? I asked, studying the timeline Patricia had created on the wall. At least 37 individuals in what appears to be an organized network. They shared methods, targets, even provided alibis for each other. Victoria has been talking non-stop since she realized cooperation was her only chance of avoiding the death penalty. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Marcus and Victoria hadn't been operating alone. They were part of a sophisticated criminal organization that specifically targeted wealthy elderly individuals with complex family situations. The group had contacts in nursing homes, law firms, medical offices, and financial institutions. They could identify vulnerable targets, gain access to their homes and finances, and execute murders that appeared completely natural. Agent Rodriguez joined us that afternoon with updates from the federal investigation. Mrs. Thornfield, Victoria's information has led us to bank accounts in 12 countries containing over $40 million in stolen assets. We're working with international authorities to freeze and recover those funds. What about the other victims' families? Have they been notified? That's actually why I'm here. Many of these families had no idea their loved ones were murdered. Some of them are asking to meet with you. They want to understand how you uncovered the truth when law enforcement missed it. That evening, I received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was shaky but determined. Mrs. Thornfield, my name is Sarah Patterson. My grandmother Eleanor was one of their victims. The FBI told me that you're organizing some kind of legal action against these people. Yes, Sarah. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother deserved so much better. Mrs. Thornfield, I need to ask you something. My grandmother changed her will 3 weeks before she died, leaving everything to my cousin Derek instead of splitting it among all the grandchildren like she had always planned. At the time, we thought maybe she was just getting confused in her old age. But now you understand that her murder was planned months in advance, and Derek was part of it. The silence on the other end was heavy with grief and rage. How many people knew about this and did nothing? How many professionals turned a blind eye because it was easier than asking questions? That question haunted me for days. As we dug deeper into the network's operations, we discovered a secondary level of culpability that was almost as disturbing as the murders themselves. Doctors who didn't question suspicious symptoms. Lawyers who processed obviously coerced will changes without investigation. Bank employees who ignored unusual transfer patterns. Care facility administrators who didn't report suspicious deaths. We need to go after the enablers too, I told Patricia over dinner in what had once been our family dining room. The people who made this possible through willful blindness or deliberate cooperation. That's a much more complex legal challenge, Margaret. Proving active conspiracy is one thing. Proving negligent enablement is quite another. Then we change the law. Patricia looked up from her legal pad with the expression I remembered from law school when I proposed seemingly impossible solutions to complex problems. Change the law how? We draft model legislation that requires mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths in elderly individuals with significant assets. We create legal obligations for professionals who interact with vulnerable populations. We make it impossible for this kind of network to operate again. Over the following weeks, I found myself working 18-hour days for the first time since my corporate law career. But this time, the stakes weren't quarterly profits or merger agreements. This time, I was fighting for the memory of my husband and the protection of every elderly person who might become a target. The civil lawsuits we filed were strategic masterpieces. Rather than simply seeking monetary damages, we crafted complaints that would expose every aspect of the network's operations. We demanded discovery that would force banks to reveal their anti-fraud procedures, require nursing homes to disclose their reporting protocols, and compel law enforcement agencies to explain why obvious patterns had been missed. But the most satisfying legal document I prepared was a personal lawsuit against Marcus and Victoria for the wrongful death of Richard Thornfield. This wasn't about money. It was about creating a public record of exactly what they had done and why they had done it. In the complaint, I detailed every lie they had told, every false expression of love they had performed, every moment they had poisoned my husband while pretending to care for him. I wanted their names permanently associated with the word murderer in legal documents that would be public record forever. "Margaret," Patricia said one evening as we reviewed witness depositions, "you realize that pursuing this case publicly means everyone will know the details of your marriage, your family life, the most intimate aspects of your relationship with Richard. Good. I want everyone to know what real love looks like, so they can recognize the fake version when they see it." The media attention began slowly, but built into a tidal wave as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. News outlets called it the Silver Network, a criminal organization that had systematically murdered elderly Americans for their inheritances. I became the face of the victims' families, the woman who had uncovered the truth and refused to let it remain hidden. But with publicity came danger. 2 months after the arrests, David Chen called me with disturbing news. "Mrs. Thornfield, we've intercepted communications suggesting that other members of the network are planning to eliminate you before the trials begin. You're the key witness against too many people. Without your testimony, their cases become much weaker." What kind of elimination? The same kind they specialized in. Something that would look like natural causes. A grieving widow who died from the stress of discovering her husband's murder. Very believable. Very difficult to prove otherwise. I thought about the threat for exactly 30 seconds before making my decision. "David, I want you to arrange something for me. I want to meet with Marcus in prison. I want him to see my face when I tell him that his threats don't scare me." "Mrs. Thornfield, that's extremely dangerous. Even in a controlled environment. David, these people have spent years believing that elderly victims are easy targets because we're weak, isolated, and afraid. It's time someone showed them what a woman with nothing left to lose can really do." 3 days later, I walked into the maximum security facility where Marcus was being held pending trial. I wore the same black suit I had worn to court during my corporate law career, and I carried a briefcase containing copies of every piece of evidence that would destroy him. When Marcus was brought into the visitor's room, I was shocked by his appearance. Prison had stripped away the veneer of respectability he had maintained for so long. He looked exactly like what he was, a violent criminal who had finally been caught. "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly. "We need to talk. If you want to know how this confrontation ends, subscribe because what I'm going to tell next will surprise you." The moment I looked into the eyes of my husband's killer, I realized that everything was about to change again. Marcus sat across from me in the sterile prison visiting room, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he had worn while stealing from his father. The bulletproof glass between us felt symbolic, a barrier that finally protected me from the poison he had been spreading through my life for years. "You look good, Margaret," he said with that same condescending smile that had once made me doubt myself. "Prison food must agree with you better than my father's cooking." Even now, even facing life in prison, he couldn't resist the cruelty. But his words no longer had power over me. "Marcus, I didn't come here to exchange pleasantries. I came to give you one final opportunity to do something decent with what's left of your miserable life." "Decent?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's rich, coming from the woman who's trying to send me to death row. You sent yourself to death row the moment you put poison in your father's food. I'm just making sure you arrive there safely." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "This contains evidence of 17 additional murders your network committed. 17 families who still don't know their loved ones were killed for money." His expression shifted slightly. For the first time since I had known him, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. The FBI has frozen $43 million in stolen assets across 12 countries. They've arrested 37 people in 7 states. Your girlfriend Victoria has provided detailed testimony about every crime you've committed together and many you committed before you met her. I placed photographs on the table between us. Do you recognize these people, Marcus? The photographs showed elderly victims from across the country, each one marked with dates, locations, and cause of death. Marcus's face went pale as he realized the scope of what Victoria had revealed. She's lying. Victoria will say anything to save herself. Actually, she's telling the truth because she's smart enough to understand that cooperation is her only chance of avoiding execution. You, on the other hand, seem determined to take responsibility for every single murder. I pulled out another document. This is a proffer agreement the prosecutor is prepared to offer you. Full confession, complete cooperation, testimony against the other network members, and detailed information about victims we haven't yet identified. In exchange, life in prison without parole instead of the death penalty. Marcus stared at the document, but didn't touch it. What makes you think I'm interested in your deal? Because the alternative is worse than death, Marcus. Much worse. I leaned forward, letting him see the cold certainty in my eyes. Without cooperation, you'll be tried for multiple counts of first-degree murder in states that enthusiastically execute killers. But before that happens, you'll spend years in legal proceedings where every detail of your crimes will be made public. Every family you destroyed will have the opportunity to testify about what you stole from them. So I'm going to personally ensure that every victim's story is told in excruciating detail. I'm going to make sure the media understands exactly what kind of monster you are. And then I'm going to do something that will destroy whatever tiny piece of humanity you have left. Marcus waited, trying to look bored, but I could see the fear growing in his eyes. I'm going to tell everyone about the real Richard Thornfield. I'm going to describe every sacrifice he made to raise you, every time he defended you when others questioned your character, every moment he chose to love you despite your obvious flaws. I'm going to make sure the world understands that you didn't just murder a wealthy man for his money. You murdered a father who loved you unconditionally. For the first time in our conversation, Marcus looked away. And then, Marcus, I'm going to make sure that Richard's story becomes the foundation for laws that prevent this from ever happening again. Your father's death is going to save lives, protect families, and create a legacy of justice that will last long after you're forgotten in whatever unmarked grave they bury executed murderers in. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more human than I had heard it in years. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to honor the man who raised you by helping us save the people you haven't killed yet. The network is still operating, Marcus. While you're sitting in this cell, other elderly people are being targeted, poisoned, murdered. You have information that could stop it. I placed one final document on the table. This is a list of names Victoria provided. People she says you worked with, planned with, learned from. Some of them are still active. Some of them have new victims already selected. Marcus studied the list, and I watched something that might have been conscience flicker across his face. If I cooperate, if I provide testimony, what happens to Victoria? Victoria gets life in prison without parole. She'll never see freedom again, but she'll live. You get the same deal, plus the knowledge that you finally did something right in your worthless existence. And if I don't cooperate, then you'll be executed, probably within 5 years. Victoria will serve life in prison anyway because her cooperation is already securing convictions. And the network will continue operating until someone else with more courage than you decides to stop it. I stood up, preparing to leave. You have 48 hours to decide, Marcus. After that, the offer expires and you face justice without mercy. As I reached the door, he called out, "Margaret, wait." I turned back, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since I had known him. Not the arrogant heir or the cunning criminal, but a broken man who had finally run out of lies to tell himself. Did my father really love me, even after he knew what I was doing? The question was so pathetic, so desperate, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Yes, Marcus. He loved you until the moment you killed him. He died hoping you would somehow become the man he tried to raise you to be. That hope was the only thing he took to his grave that you couldn't steal. I left him sitting in that sterile room with the weight of that truth. 2 days later, his lawyer called to say Marcus was ready to cooperate fully. The confession he provided over the following weeks was comprehensive and devastating. Names, dates, methods, victims we hadn't identified, ongoing operations we could interrupt. His testimony would ultimately lead to 47 arrests and the conviction of an entire criminal network. But more importantly, his cooperation would help us save lives that were still in danger. As I drove home from the prison that final day, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's death. Complete peace. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being multiplied, extended, transformed into protection for future victims. The trap we had set wasn't just for Marcus and Victoria. It was for everyone who preyed on the vulnerable, everyone who saw elderly wealth as easy pickings, everyone who mistook kindness for weakness. They had all underestimated the fury of a woman who had finally learned to use her love as a weapon. The federal courthouse in downtown was buzzing with media attention as the first major trial in the Silver Network conspiracy began. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing the pearls Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary, watching as Marcus was led into the courtroom in shackles. The transformation was complete. The man who had once strutted through my house like he owned it now shuffled like the broken criminal he had always been underneath his mask of respectability. But this trial wasn't just about Marcus. It was about sending a message to every predator who thought elderly victims were easy targets. Prosecutor Janet Williams stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who held an unbeatable hand. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 2 weeks, you're going to hear about crimes so calculated, so heartless, that they will challenge your faith in human decency. But you're also going to hear about courage, about love that transcends death, and about justice that refuses to be buried with its victims. She gestured toward me. Margaret Thornfield could have accepted her inheritance quietly and moved on with her life. Instead, she chose to fight for the truth, not just for her husband, but for every elderly person who has become prey for these predators. The first witness was Dr. Jennifer Morrison, the forensic toxicologist who had analyzed Richard's blood samples. Her testimony was clinical, precise, and absolutely damning. Mr. Thornfield's blood showed consistent levels of digoxin over a period of approximately 8 months, she explained to the jury. The pattern of accumulation is consistent with regular, deliberate administration of the drug in doses designed to avoid immediate detection while causing gradual cardiac failure. In your professional opinion, Dr. Morrison, was this poisoning accidental? Absolutely not. The levels we found, combined with the timeline of administration, could only result from intentional, systematic poisoning. Someone with access to Mr. Thornfield's food or medication was deliberately killing him over an extended period. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Chen, who had been hired with money Marcus no longer possessed, tried to challenge the medical evidence. Dr. Morrison, isn't it possible that an elderly man with existing heart conditions might naturally develop these symptoms? Not with these specific digoxin levels in his system. Mr. Thornfield was not prescribed digoxin by any physician. The only way this drug entered his system was through deliberate administration by another person. When David Chen took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, the courtroom fell silent. His testimony about the months-long investigation, the evidence Richard had gathered, and the systematic nature of the crimes painted a picture of evil that was almost beyond comprehension. Mr. Thornfield suspected something was wrong when he noticed discrepancies in his business accounts, David explained. But what started as a financial investigation quickly revealed something much more sinister. Bank transfers that didn't make sense, medical symptoms that didn't match his prescribed medications, and behavior changes in people he trusted. What did Mr. Thornfield ask you to do with this information? He asked me to document everything, to build a case that would protect his wife and ensure that the people responsible faced justice. Even while he was being slowly murdered, his primary concern was making sure Margaret would be safe and that the truth would come out. The prosecutor presented the jury with Richard's personal notes, his medical records, and the recordings that had captured Marcus and Victoria planning their crimes. Each piece of evidence was like another nail in a coffin that was already sealed. But the most powerful testimony came from Victoria herself. She had been brought from prison to testify against Marcus as part of her plea agreement. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit with her hands and feet shackled, she looked nothing like the ambitious young woman who had once redecorated my living room. "Victoria Thornfield," Prosecutor Williams began, "please tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant. Marcus and I were partners in business and in life. We had been planning to take control of his father's estate for over 3 years. What did that planning involve?" Victoria's answer was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that made her words even more chilling. "We researched methods of elimination that would appear natural. We established financial structures to hide stolen money. We developed timelines for gradually taking control of Richard's assets while slowly killing him. When you say elimination, what exactly do you mean?" "Murder. We were planning to murder Richard Thornfield for his money." The courtroom was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. Even the most hardened court reporters looked shocked by her casual admission. "How did you plan to accomplish this murder?" "Digoxin poisoning administered over several months through his food and beverages. Marcus had access to his father's meals, and I researched the proper dosages to avoid immediate detection while ensuring eventual cardiac failure." The defense attorney tried desperately to discredit Victoria's testimony, suggesting she was lying to save herself from execution. But her account matched every piece of physical evidence, every medical finding, every detail that David Chen had independently discovered. More damaging still, Victoria provided details about their other victims, their methods, their network of accomplices. She described their crimes with the detachment of someone reading a grocery list, never showing a moment of remorse or regret. "Victoria, did the defendant ever express any concern about killing his father?" "No. Marcus said his father had lived long enough and it was time for the next generation to take control. He viewed Richard as an obstacle to our future prosperity." "Did he ever express love or affection for his father during the planning stages?" "Only when he was practicing how to act grief-stricken after the murder. Marcus was very concerned about appearing to be the devastated son at the funeral. When it came time for Marcus to take the stand in his own defense, I watched him struggle with the impossible task of explaining away overwhelming evidence. His attorney had coached him to show remorse, to claim he had been manipulated by Victoria, to portray himself as a victim of circumstances, but Marcus couldn't maintain the act. Under cross-examination, his true nature emerged like poison, seeping through a cracked facade. "Mr. Thornfield," Prosecutor Williams said, "your stepmother Margaret sacrificed her legal career to help raise you. How do you respond to that? She made her choice. Nobody forced her to give up her job. She attended every one of your soccer games, every graduation, every important event in your life. Do you remember that? I suppose. She loved you like a son for over 30 years. Do you acknowledge that?" Marcus's mask finally slipped completely. Margaret was paid well for her services. She lived in a mansion, wore expensive clothes, traveled wherever she wanted. She got what she deserved. The prosecutor pressed harder. "Mr. Thornfield, do you feel any remorse for murdering the man who raised you?" "I feel remorse for getting caught." The gasps from the jury box were audible. Even his own attorney looked stunned by the admission. "So you're not sorry your father is dead?" "My father was old. He was going to die anyway. We just accelerated the timeline." In that moment, Marcus had convicted himself more thoroughly than any evidence could have accomplished. The jury saw him exactly as he was, a remorseless killer who viewed human life as nothing more than an obstacle to his greed. The verdict came back after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, financial fraud, and elder abuse. The sentence: life in prison without possibility of parole. As the judge read the verdict, I felt Richard's presence beside me like a warm hand on my shoulder. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being broadcast to every predator who thought they could prey on vulnerable elderly people without consequence. But this was just the beginning. We had 46 more cases to prosecute, millions of dollars to recover, and a network of criminals to dismantle. As I left the courthouse that day, reporters surrounded me with questions about how it felt to see my stepson convicted of murdering my husband. "It feels like the first step in a longer journey," I told them. Richard's death started something that won't end until every elderly person in this country can live without fear of being murdered for their assets. The first domino had fallen. Now, it was time to bring down the rest. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, I stood in the same federal courthouse watching the final pieces of the silver network fall like dominoes in a carefully orchestrated collapse. What had started as my personal quest for justice had become the largest elder abuse prosecution in American history. The courtroom was packed with families of victims, FBI agents, and reporters from across the country. Today's hearing would determine the fate of the last 7 network leaders, including the man who had created the entire operation. Dr. Malcolm Sterling, a respected geriatrician who had been using his medical practice to identify wealthy, isolated elderly patients for his network of killers. Dr. Sterling sat at the defendant's table, looking nothing like the distinguished physician who had once been featured on magazine covers as America's advocate for senior health. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Patient records showing suspicious deaths, bank accounts containing millions in stolen assets, and recorded conversations detailing how to identify and eliminate profitable targets. But the most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source: his own medical journals, discovered during a raid on his home office. Prosecutor Williams read excerpts to the packed courtroom. Patient exhibits classic isolation markers: estranged children, minimal social contact, substantial liquid assets, recommend standard protocol, establish trust, modify medication regimen, initiate asset transfer procedures, timeline, 6 to 8 months for complete liquidation. The clinical language made the crimes even more horrifying. Dr. Sterling had been treating human beings like livestock, evaluating them for their financial value rather than their medical needs. Entry dated March 15, 2023, Williams continued. Patient Richard Thornfield presents interesting challenges: strong marriage, suspicious nature, background in business acquisition, may require specialized approach, recommended asset, stepson with access and motivation. I gripped the armrest of my chair so tightly my knuckles went white. This monster had specifically targeted Richard because of his wealth and identified Marcus as the weapon to destroy him. Entry dated September 20th, 2023. Thornfield elimination proceeding on schedule. Stepson demonstrates excellent aptitude for covert administration. Wife remains oblivious. Estimated completion, spring 2024. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Harrison gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Dr. Sterling had documented Richard's murder like it was a medical procedure. When Dr. Sterling's defense attorney tried to argue that the journals were theoretical exercises, not actual crime planning, Prosecutor Williams destroyed that fiction with phone records, bank transfers, and testimony from 17 network members who had already been convicted. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams said in her closing argument, Dr. Malcolm Sterling didn't just participate in these murders, he industrialized them. He created a system for identifying victims, recruiting killers, and disposing of evidence. He turned the trust between doctor and patient into a weapon for mass murder. The verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty on 43 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and elder abuse. The sentence: death by lethal injection. As Dr. Sterling was led away in chains, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced since Richard's death. The man who had created the system that killed my husband would pay with his own life, but the personal victory was overshadowed by the broader impact of our investigation. Over 18 months, we had dismantled a criminal network that had operated in 12 states, murdered hundreds of elderly people, and stolen over $200 million in assets. More importantly, our work had led to fundamental changes in how the system protects vulnerable elderly populations. The Richard Thornfield Elder Protection Act had been signed into law 3 months earlier, creating mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious deaths in wealthy elderly individuals, establishing federal oversight of estate planning practices, and creating severe penalties for professionals who enabled elder abuse through willful blindness. Medical schools now required courses on recognizing signs of elder abuse. Banking institutions had implemented new protocols for detecting suspicious asset transfers from elderly accounts. Nursing homes and care facilities faced regular federal inspections specifically focused on identifying potential victim targeting. But perhaps most satisfying was the civil lawsuit victories that had recovered over $150 million for victims' families. Every penny stolen by the network had been traced, frozen, and returned to the people who rightfully owned it. As I walked down the courthouse steps that final day, I was surrounded by other victim family members who had become my friends and allies in this fight. Sarah Patterson, whose grandmother Eleanor had been one of the first victims we identified. Michael Chen, whose elderly parents had been murdered for their restaurant profits. Diana Rodriguez, whose father had been killed for his military pension. Margaret, Sarah said as we paused on the courthouse steps, I keep thinking about what would have happened if you had just accepted your inheritance and stayed quiet. How many more people would have died? It was a question that haunted me. If I had been the meek widow they expected, if I had accepted Marcus's cruelty and Victoria's manipulation, if I had grieved in silence and moved on with my life, how many more families would have been destroyed? The important thing, I replied, is that it's over now. Richard's death wasn't meaningless. It exposed something evil and helped us stop it. That evening, I returned to the house that had become both my sanctuary and my command center. The rooms where Marcus and Victoria had once planned murder were now filled with law books, victim testimonies, and legal briefs that had saved lives. I poured myself a glass of the wine Richard and I had been saving for our 40th anniversary and sat in his favorite chair in the study. On the desk was a framed photo from our wedding day, both of us young and full of hope, believing that love could conquer anything. We did it, my love, I whispered to his picture. Every one of them is paying for what they did to you. But even in victory, I knew this wasn't really an ending. It was a transformation. The woman who had buried her career to build a family had been reborn as something stronger, a protector, an advocate, a force for justice that would continue fighting as long as there were predators who targeted the vulnerable. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Patricia, calling from her office where she was working on our next case. Margaret, I just got a call from the FBI field office in Miami. They think they've identified another network, similar structure, but focused on elderly immigrants who don't trust traditional banking systems. They want to know if we're interested in consulting on the investigation. I looked at Richard's photo, at the evidence files that still covered every surface of his study, at the life I had built from the ashes of tragedy. Tell them we'll be there Monday morning, I said. It's time to put these predators out of business permanently. The Silver Network was destroyed, but the work of protecting the vulnerable would never end. And Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, attorney and warrior, was just getting started. Turn on the notification bell, because in the next few minutes I'm going to reveal how this story ends and the final surprise that even I didn't see coming. 2 years after the final convictions, I thought I had heard the last secrets the Silver Network could reveal. I was wrong, dead wrong, in a way that would shake everything I believed about Richard's final months and my own role in his murder. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for a victim advocacy conference in Chicago. Agent Rodriguez's voice carried a weight I hadn't heard since the early days of our investigation. Mrs. Thornfield, we need to meet immediately. Something has come to light that changes. Well, it changes everything about your husband's case. 3 hours later, I sat in the same FBI field office where we had planned the takedown of Marcus and Victoria, but this time the atmosphere was different, heavier, more ominous. Agent Rodriguez placed a thick file on the table between us. Margaret, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult. We discovered this evidence during the final search of Dr. Sterling's private residence, in a hidden safe we only just managed to access. He opened the file to reveal documents I had never seen before. Detailed medical records, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be a treatment protocol with Richard's name at the top. Dr. Sterling wasn't just targeting your husband randomly. He had been Richard's personal physician for over 15 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. Richard's doctor was Dr. Hampton. I went to appointments with him, I knew. Dr. Hampton was Richard's official physician, yes, but for the past 15 years, your husband had been secretly receiving treatment from Dr. Sterling for a condition he never told you about. Agent Rodriguez pulled out medical records that made my blood run cold. Margaret, your husband had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 14 months before his death. The room began spinning around me. No, that's not possible. Richard was sharp, focused, completely lucid until the day he died. The early stages of Alzheimer's can be masked, especially in highly intelligent individuals who develop coping mechanisms. Your husband was taking experimental medications that Dr. Sterling was providing through a clinical trial program. I stared at the medical records, seeing Richard's handwriting on consent forms, his signature on treatment protocols, dates and times of appointments I had never known about. Why wouldn't he tell me? We shared everything. We had no secrets between us. According to Dr. Sterling's notes, your husband was terrified of becoming a burden to you. He was also concerned about what would happen to his estate if he became legally incompetent. The Alzheimer's diagnosis was what made him vulnerable to Dr. Sterling's manipulation. Agent Rodriguez showed me more documents, a treatment plan that had gradually been modified to include medications that would accelerate cognitive decline, financial planning sessions where Dr. Sterling had convinced Richard to make estate planning changes to protect his assets from potential medical expenses. Dr. Sterling wasn't just Richard's doctor. He was his advisor, his confidant, the person your husband trusted with his deepest fears about losing his mind. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Sterling convinced Richard that Marcus might try to have him declared incompetent. Exactly. Sterling fed your husband's paranoia about Marcus while simultaneously providing Marcus with information about Richard's condition and medications. He was playing both sides, manipulating Richard's fears while enabling Marcus's crimes. I felt sick to my stomach. Sterling was the one who suggested Richard start investigating Marcus. Yes, he provided Richard with the private investigator's contact information, encouraged him to install recording devices, even helped him plan the legal protections he put in place for you. But all of it was designed to create the perfect murder scenario. Agent Rodriguez pulled out the most devastating document of all, a detailed timeline showing how Dr. Sterling had orchestrated every aspect of Richard's final months. Sterling convinced Richard that documenting Marcus's crimes was essential for protecting you. But what Richard didn't know was that Sterling was simultaneously providing Marcus with information about Richard's declining cognitive state and his investigation activities. Sterling was feeding information to both sides. He told Marcus exactly when Richard was recording conversations, which financial irregularities Richard had discovered, and how to modify the poisoning schedule to avoid the specific tests Richard was having done. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, that it took my breath away. Richard had died believing he was protecting me from Marcus, never knowing that his trusted physician was the architect of his own murder. There's more, Margaret. Sterling's notes indicate that he had been planning to eliminate you as well, once the estate was settled and Marcus had control of the assets. I looked up from the documents, finally understanding the full scope of what we had uncovered. Sterling was the real mastermind behind everything. Not just your husband's murder, but the entire Silver Network. We found evidence that he had been recruiting and training teams of killers for over a decade, using his medical practice to identify targets and his professional reputation to avoid suspicion. Agent Rodriguez showed me photographs from Sterling's hidden office, detailed victim profiles, financial analysis charts, recruitment materials for potential killers, and training manuals for administering untraceable poisons. Margaret, Dr. Sterling didn't just create a criminal network. He created a murder factory. We estimate he was responsible for orchestrating over 300 deaths across 15 states over the past 12 years. The number was staggering, almost incomprehensible. 300 families destroyed by one man's greed and complete lack of human conscience. But there's something else, something that makes this personal for you in a way you couldn't have imagined. Agent Rodriguez pulled out one final document, a patient file with my name on it. Dr. Sterling had been planning to recruit you as his next accomplice. My hands trembled as I read the file. Sterling had documented my legal background, my financial situation, my emotional state after Richard's death. He had been evaluating me as a potential asset for his network. According to his notes, he believed that once you discovered Marcus's betrayal and inherited Richard's estate, you would be the perfect recruiter for future operations. A respected attorney with access to wealthy elderly clients, motivated by revenge, and skilled in legal manipulation. I thought about all the victim families I had worked with, all the elderly people who had trusted me with their stories, their fears, their vulnerabilities. Sterling had seen them not as people I was trying to protect, but as potential targets I could help him exploit. He underestimated one fundamental thing about you, Margaret. What's that? He assumed that discovering betrayal would make you cynical and greedy like him. He never considered that it might make you determined to protect others from the same fate. As I sat in that office, surrounded by evidence of evil that went deeper than I had ever imagined, I felt a strange sense of completion. Richard's death hadn't just exposed a criminal network, it had revealed a monster who had been hiding behind a medical degree and a trusted profession for over a decade. Agent Rodriguez, what happens to this information? How do we make sure Sterling pays for all of it? The death penalty case is being expanded to include charges for every murder we can definitively link to him. We're talking about the largest mass murder prosecution in American history. I looked at the photographs of Sterling's victims, hundreds of elderly faces representing lives cut short by calculated evil. Among them was Richard's picture. But now I understood he hadn't just been a victim. He had been a hero who had unknowingly helped expose the monster who was destroying so many lives. There's one more thing, Margaret. Sterling left behind detailed records of other networks he had helped establish. This isn't over. There are more Dr. Sterlings out there, more networks, more victims who need protection. I closed the file and looked Agent Rodriguez in the eye. Then we keep fighting. We track down every one of them. We protect every potential victim, and we make sure that no other family goes through what Richard and I went through. As I left the FBI office that day, I understood that my husband's legacy wasn't just the money he had left me or the legal protections he had put in place. His real legacy was the revelation of a systematic evil that could now be stopped. Dr. Sterling had thought he was manipulating Richard's investigation for his own purposes. What he had actually done was provide us with the roadmap to destroy everything he had built. The monster was finally unmasked. Now it was time to slay him completely. 5 years after Richard's death, I stood before the largest gathering of elder abuse prevention advocates in the country, addressing the annual conference of the National Coalition for Senior Protection. The ballroom was filled with prosecutors, investigators, medical professionals, and families who had been touched by crimes similar to what had happened to my husband. But this wasn't just another conference. Today, we were announcing the establishment of the Richard Thornfield Foundation for Elder Justice, funded by the recovered assets from the Silver Network and dedicated to preventing elder abuse before it happens. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out at the faces of people who had become my allies in this fight. 5 years ago, I thought I was just a grieving widow who had discovered her stepson's betrayal. I had no idea I was uncovering a conspiracy that would lead to the exposure of the largest elder abuse network in American history. The audience was silent, attentive. Many of them had followed our case from the beginning, had seen the trials, had watched as we dismantled an empire built on the systematic murder of elderly Americans. Today, I can report that Dr. Malcolm Sterling was executed 3 weeks ago for his crimes. Marcus Thornfield and Victoria Thornfield continue serving life sentences without possibility of parole. Every member of their network has been prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced. Over $400 million in stolen assets have been recovered and returned to victims' families. The applause was thunderous, but I raised my hand for quiet. But statistics don't tell the real story. The real story is about the power of love that refuses to die, even when death seems to have won. I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, showing a photograph of Richard and me from our last anniversary dinner together. My husband, Richard, died believing he was protecting me from people who wanted to harm us. What he actually did was provide us with the tools to protect thousands of other families from the same fate. The next slide showed the legislative victories we had achieved. The Richard Thornfield Elder Protection Act, now law in all 50 states. The National Elder Abuse Registry, which tracks suspicious deaths and financial irregularities across state lines. the medical professional accountability standards, which require mandatory reporting of suspected elder abuse by healthcare providers. But laws alone don't protect people. Community does. Vigilance does. Love that refuses to be silent in the face of evil does. I told them about the 23 additional elder abuse networks we had helped expose over the past 5 years, about the prevention programs now operating in nursing homes across the country, about the financial institutions that had implemented new protections for elderly accounts, about the medical schools that now required courses in recognizing and reporting elder abuse. When Richard was being slowly poisoned by people he trusted, he could have given up. He could have accepted his fate quietly. Instead, he fought back with the only weapons he had: documentation, preparation, and love for the woman he was leaving behind. The slide changed to show the faces of lives we had saved. Elderly people who had been targeted by predators but were protected by the systems we had built in Richard's memory. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, 87, was being targeted by a home healthcare worker who had already stolen $50,000 from her accounts. Our financial monitoring systems detected the irregular transfers and stopped the theft before it escalated to murder. Mr. George Chen, 91, was being systematically poisoned by his grandson, who wanted to inherit his restaurant business. Our medical reporting protocols identified the suspicious symptoms and saved his life. Dorothy and Frank Williams, married for 62 years, were being manipulated by a financial advisor who was planning to eliminate them after transferring their assets to offshore accounts. Our legal oversight programs exposed the scheme before any harm was done. Each face on the screen represented a family that would remain intact, a life that would continue, a story that would have a happy ending because Richard's death had taught us how to recognize and stop predators before they could kill. The foundation we're establishing today will ensure that these protective systems continue to grow and improve. But more than that, it will ensure that every elderly person in this country knows they have advocates, protectors, people who will fight for them if they can't fight for themselves. I paused, feeling Richard's presence with me in that moment as clearly as if he were standing beside me at the podium. I want to close with something my husband wrote in his final letter to me, words that have guided everything we've accomplished since his death. The capacity to love unconditionally is not a weakness. It's the greatest strength a person can have. Use that strength like the weapon it is. The audience rose in spontaneous applause, but I wasn't finished. Richard was right. Love is a weapon. It's a weapon against cynicism, against cruelty, against the kind of evil that sees vulnerable people as opportunities rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect. I looked out at the faces of people who had dedicated their careers to protecting the vulnerable, people who had chosen to use their love as a weapon against predators and monsters. Marcus and Victoria thought they were destroying a naive old woman who would be easy to eliminate once they had stolen everything that mattered to her. They had no idea they were actually creating their own worst nightmare. A woman with nothing left to lose, unlimited resources, and a very specific set of skills. The laughter that followed was knowing, appreciative. They understood what it meant to transform grief into purpose, tragedy into triumph. The work we do isn't just about prosecuting criminals or recovering stolen money. It's about honoring the memory of every person who was murdered for their assets by ensuring that their deaths have meaning, that their stories save other lives, that their love continues to protect people they never met. I concluded with a promise that had become my life's mission. As long as there are predators who target elderly people, as long as there are families being destroyed by greed and evil, as long as there are vulnerable people who need protection, the Richard Thornfield Foundation will be there to fight for them. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but what moved me most was what happened afterward. One by one, victim family members, prosecutors, investigators, and advocates approached me to share their own stories, their own commitments to continuing this fight. That evening, I returned to the house where this journey had begun. The rooms where Marcus and Victoria had once planned murder were now filled with foundation offices, legal clinics, and support groups for elder abuse survivors. I sat in Richard's study, now converted into my personal office, surrounded by photographs of the families we had helped, the cases we had won, the lives we had saved. On the desk was the original letter Richard had written for me to read after learning the truth about his murder. "My dearest Margaret," I read aloud to the empty room. "If you're reading this, it means the worst has happened, but it also means you now have the power to make it right." And we had made it right. Not just for Richard, not just for our family, but for hundreds of families who would never know how close they had come to tragedy. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Agent Rodriguez with news about a potential elder abuse case in Oregon that needed our foundation's expertise. "Tell them we'll be there Monday morning," I said, closing Richard's letter and reaching for my briefcase. "It's time to put another predator out of business." As I prepared for the next battle in a war that would never truly end, I felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. Richard's love had survived his death, transformed into a force that would protect vulnerable people for generations to come. Marcus and Victoria had tried to destroy everything that mattered to us. Instead, they had created something beautiful, powerful, and eternal, a legacy of justice that would ensure their evil could never be replicated. The house was quiet as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of grief and loss. It was the peaceful silence of a woman who had found her purpose, honored her husband's memory, and turned the worst tragedy of her life into the greatest triumph. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new predators to stop, new families to protect. But tonight, for the first time since Richard's death, I slept the sleep of someone who had finally, completely won. Remember what I learned. Our age is our greatest strength, not our weakness. Subscribe if you believe that too, because sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil is simply a woman who refuses to be silenced, refuses to be defeated, and refuses to let love die with the grave.